4,000 years before Anakin Skywalker became Darth Vader, the Jedi Order had already watched the exact same thing happen once before. The Sith found a gifted young prodigy, isolated him from his teachers, convinced him the Council could not understand the threat he saw, and slowly turned him into a weapon against the Republic. His name was Revan. The Jedi wrote down exactly how it happened. Then they forgot to read it when Darth Sidious did it again. The first sign was small. Revan's fall began with a mask. The world was Cathar, and the war was the Mandalorian conflict, a brutal campaign of conquest waged by a warrior culture against any species that stood in its way. By the time Revan and his fellow Jedi arrived, most of the Cathar species had already been wiped out. The young knight walked through silent streets where the slaughter had ended a decade earlier, and only the wreckage remained, weathered into the rock. As light caught a Mandalorian helmet half buried near the shore, all the Jedi present shared a single Force vision, a Mandalorian woman in that helmet pleading with her commander, Cassius Fett, to spare the surviving Cathar, Fett refusing, and the woman dying as she defended the people she had been sent to kill. Revan took up the helmet, vowing not to remove it until the Mandalorians were defeated, and in honoring the woman who had tried to stop the genocide, he made her unfinished work his own. What he did not admit, even to Malak, was that the vow was already changing him. He had taken a stranger's martyrdom and folded it into his own identity, casting himself as the one person who could finish a cause larger than himself. The old masters had warned their students for centuries about exactly this. A Jedi who starts believing he is the answer. The young prodigy believed himself above the warning because his cause was just. 4,000 years later, a different prodigy in a different war was telling himself a very similar story. Anakin Skywalker studied what the Council called forbidden knowledge and assured himself he would only use it to save the people he loved. He grew his friendship with Palpatine and told himself it was strictly political. He convinced himself, as Revan had, that pure intentions would purify the tools he picked up. The resemblance went deeper than judgment. Both were genuine prodigies, hailed in their own time as the finest Jedi alive, with strategic minds that humbled their teachers, and a magnetism that began to look like personal loyalty. Revan led an entire faction of Jedi Knights into battle against the Council's clear orders during the Mandalorian Wars. The Chosen One drew the same kind of pull around himself during the Clone Wars, gaining devotion from clone troopers, political figures, and fellow Jedi alike. Both times, an order that valued group judgment watched one of its own become the center of his own orbit, and both times the Council answered with hesitation rather than action. The closest companion each prodigy kept carries the deepest echo. Revan's friendship with Malak was the defining bond of his early career, and through it, much of his corruption spread outward. When the future Dark Lord fell, Malak fell with him, two halves of the same disaster, one the visionary, the other the enforcer. Anakin's closest bond ran the opposite direction. Obi-Wan Kenobi was not a partner in his decline, he was a teacher trying constantly to pull his former apprentice back from it. Malak had no reason to resist Revan's pull, so he sped it up. Kenobi had every reason to resist Anakin's drift, and he did. But the Council placed on one young master's shoulders the burden that, in Revan's case, had needed an entire council to reverse. Revan did not simply slip into darkness, he was hunted into it, deliberately and patiently, by something the Jedi did not believe existed anymore. In the far reaches beyond the charted galaxy, on that same storm-racked world of Dromund Kaas, a being who called himself Emperor had been preparing for centuries. The Jedi who eventually faced him called him Vitiate. Vitiate was not a conqueror, but a patient predator who had spent centuries studying how Jedi break. When the Mandalorian Wars sent a young prodigy chasing the defeated Mandalorians into the unknown regions, Vitiate did not have to find Revan. He just had to wait. What happened on Dromund Kaas became one of the most important case studies the Jedi ever preserved, because the Jedi of the late Republic had this in writing. After defeating Mandalore the Ultimate, Revan had heard the truth from the dying warrior's own lips. The Sith's hold on Mandalore had broken in his final moments, and he told Revan that the entire Mandalorian campaign had been engineered by a Sith power hiding in the unknown regions. The two Jedi followed that thread alone, and in secret, all the way to the throne world. They believed they were the hunters. They did not understand that they were exactly where Vitiate had been waiting. The Mandalorian Wars themselves had been a test, and the gifted Jedi who emerged victorious were the prize. Vitiate did not need to befriend Revan or draw him in. The shape of Revan's life, his self-cast role as the one Jedi who saw what the Council refused to see, had already brought him to the throne room door. When that moment came, Vitiate did not need a duel or years of grooming. He broke them. In a single confrontation, he dominated the minds of both Jedi at once and turned Revan's will toward the very dominion Revan had come to oppose. The men who walked out of that throne room still wore the faces of Revan and Malak, but the minds inside had been replaced. From that point forward, the Order knew exactly what this looked like. Vitiate's method did not die with the Jedi Civil War. The Jedi who debriefed the restored Revan preserved it in careful detail. The records described, in concrete terms, the kind of Jedi a patient dark side operator looks for, a gifted prodigy who had already cast himself as the unique answer to a problem larger than his order, willing to follow that conviction past every safeguard the Council had built. 4,000 years later, Palpatine followed that script almost beat for beat. Sidious did not reveal himself as a Dark Lord. He approached first as an interested senator, then as a concerned statesman, and finally as the only political figure who seemed to take Anakin's ambitions seriously. He flattered the Chosen One's strategic instincts and isolated him politically through a web of secrets and unofficial assignments outside the Order's normal supervision. When the moment came, he did not defeat his target in combat, but reshaped him from within, turning Anakin's love for Padme into the lever that opened the door to the dark side. The Jedi Order of the late Republic knew the first one in heavy detail, and their tragedy was not that they had failed to predict Palpatine's method from nothing. It was that they had already survived it once, written down how it worked, and filed the instructions in a vault they no longer used. What makes the failure sharper still is that the old Jedi did not just write down the disease, they wrote down the cure. In the years after the Jedi Civil War, the Order pulled off something with no equal in the later history of the galaxy. They took a fully corrupted Dark Lord, a man who had led fleets against the Republic he had been raised to protect, and rebuilt him into a Jedi again, not through magic, but through patience, reconnection, and the careful repair of broken bonds. A young Jedi Knight named Bastila Shan led the strike team that boarded Revan's flagship to bring him in alive. They caught him at the moment Malak struck him down in betrayal. Bastila used the Force to keep the dying Dark Lord alive and preserve his broken mind, and in doing so, she formed a Force bond with him. That bond was the lever the Council needed. Through it, Revan's original self could be reached. What the Masters did next was morally questionable, and they knew it. They used the Force to wipe his memory and rebuild his identity from scratch, placing him back into Republic service under careful watch, surrounded by companions who knew nothing of his former life. The companions who served at his side had no idea the quiet, principled man fighting alongside them had once led fleets against the Republic. What they observed was not meditation, but behavior. He turned back to help worlds he had no orders to help, risked his life for crew members he barely knew, and extended trust to wary strangers who had every reason not to trust him. He was not being lectured back into the light, he was acting his way back into it, one decision at a time, consistently enough and long enough that the man he had been before Vitiate began to come back on his own. The redemption of Revan was not a single miracle. A second case ran beside it and doubled the lesson. The Jedi exile Meetra Surik had served as one of Revan's generals during the Mandalorian campaigns. At Malachor V, she was caught at the heart of a weapon so terrible the trauma severed her connection to the Force. She wandered the galaxy afterward with no power, no order, and no identity beyond what the war had left her. When she returned, the Jedi who had once known her were nearly all dead, and the Order itself was teetering. Her return to the Force was guided by the most haunting character in this entire story, a woman named Kreia, who had once been a Jedi Master and Revan's own teacher before the Council exiled her for his fall. She had walked the dark path herself, taken the title of Darth Vader, been betrayed in turn by her own Sith apprentices, and emerged from the wreckage as something that was neither Jedi nor Sith, but had studied the machinery of both. Her body of philosophy, passed to Meetra Surik as her last student, argued that bonds forged in shared suffering could pull a Jedi back from the abyss or push them further into it, depending on who held the other end of the bond. The difference matters. What the Jedi had recorded about Revan was history, while what Kreia had taught was diagnosis. The students she shaped went on to rebuild the Jedi Order, and her core argument traveled with them, that the most dangerous moment in a young Jedi's life is not when he meets a Sith, but when he decides his teachers do not understand him, and that the bonds the Council tells him to release are the very ones that, properly held, could keep him in the light. Kreia's framework fits Anakin Skywalker exactly. By Kreia's reading, every intervention the Council made in Anakin's life was backward. Their insistence on emotional detachment was not protecting him from the dark side. It was actively preparing him for it, severing the bonds that could have held him in the light and leaving Palpatine's as the only one still standing. The Revan Protocol would have told them to tie those bonds tighter, not cut them loose. A council that understood the earlier rehabilitation would have treated Anakin's attachments as warning signals to guide carefully, not weaknesses to suppress. The case for how to do it was already sitting in the archives, but the Clone Wars Council was too tired, too stretched thin, too sure that old rules were enough. The Jedi archives, kept by Madame Jocasta Nu, were the most complete library of Force-related knowledge in the known galaxy. The Jedi Civil War had nearly destroyed the Order, and the Council that rebuilt it afterward had overseen Revan's rehabilitation firsthand. What they knew about how he fell and how he came back would have been among the most important records the Order ever kept. And then there is Jocasta Nu. The librarian held a file, but the Council did not ask. The system she had been hired to serve treated her domain as a memorial rather than as a working tool. It was not carelessness, it was exhaustion. The Clone Wars had turned the Jedi from teachers into generals. Masters who should have been mentoring Padawans were leading clone legions, and knights who should have been studying the archives were writing battle reports. No one had time to read a 4,000-year-old case file when there were campaigns to plan and soldiers to bury. But exhaustion was only half the problem. The Force itself had been clouded by the rising influence of the dark side, and Yoda and Mace Windu both said so openly. The dark side was not just hiding Palpatine, it was hiding the pattern. The same fog that made the Council unable to see the Sith Lord in the Senate was making them unable to see the Revan playbook running in front of them. Yoda, above all, should have caught it. Yoda had been alive for nearly 9 centuries. The Revan case was among the most heavily documented cautionary examples in the Order's history, and a master of Yoda's age and learning would have had access to it. When he sensed fear in young Anakin during his first testing on Coruscant, the pattern recognition should have been immediate. A gifted child, already shaped by attachments he cannot release, showing fear as his main emotional signal was exactly the kind of candidate the Revan case had warned against. He named the risk clearly, but what he and the Council did not do was commit to the intervention it called for. They voiced the warning without acting on it. By the time the war began, the boy they had reluctantly admitted was already a man, already a knight, already in regular private conversation with the Sith Lord they could not see. By the final year of the Clone Wars, the pattern was no longer theoretical. It was happening in plain sight. Anyone paying attention could see it. Anakin Skywalker was already halfway gone. The clone troopers of the 501st Legion loved their general because he fought like no other Jedi, took risks no careful commander would take, and formed attachments the Order had always taught its knights to restrain. Other Jedi saw different pieces of the same collapse. Anakin's growing dependence on Palpatine, his resentment toward the Council, his willingness to move outside the normal chain of command. All of it pointed towards the same pattern the Revan records had preserved for thousands of years. The correct response in the Revan precedent had been to pull the drifting Jedi out of the dark side's reach immediately and surround him with the community he had started to leave behind. The Council's response in Anakin's case was almost the exact opposite. The deeper problem was that the Jedi no longer believed the Sith could operate this way at all. The Jedi of the late Republic had built their modern identity around the idea that their ancient enemies were extinct. The Revan archives directly contradicted that idea. To take those warnings seriously as a live diagnosis, the Council would have had to admit that their basic reading of their own era was wrong, that the Sith were not extinct and were operating in the Senate at that moment. They could not make that admission in time. The Chosen One paid the price for their hesitation. By the final year of the Clone Wars, the pattern reached the opera box on Coruscant. The legend of Darth Plagueis the Wise was not idle conversation. It was a precision strike aimed at the same psychological weakness Vitiate had once exploited in Revan. The belief that enough knowledge, enough power, could protect the people once loved from forces the Jedi refused to face. Any master familiar with the Revan archives would have recognized Palpatine's story as a textbook opening move. Anakin heard it and went home to worry about Padme. The Council had every resource to understand what had just been attempted, and no system in place to act. And yet, the protocol the Jedi had forgotten was not lost forever. It found its way back into the galaxy through the most unlikely route imaginable. Luke Skywalker received none of the archive training that his father's generation had thrown away. He was taught by an exile Yoda in the swamps of Dagobah and by a hidden Obi-Wan Kenobi in the wastes of Tatooine. Neither teacher walked him through the Revan file, explained the rehabilitation protocol, or offered him a framework for spotting when a fallen Jedi might still be reachable through the restoration of bonds. The farm boy from Tatooine worked the method out himself through instinct and love and the strange inheritance of being his father's son. And then he walked, alone and unarmed, into the throne room of the Emperor. Through the lens of the Revan file, every choice Luke makes is the right one, though he makes them without knowing the file exists. He arrives in binders, surrendering himself willingly, knowing he cannot fight his way to his father, but has to come to him. He stands before Vader and calls him by his old name, Anakin Skywalker, not the Sith title, and not the rank. This is the same move Bastila Shan had used 4,000 years earlier, refusing to let the captured Dark Lord answer to the title he had built for himself, insisting on the man underneath. Vader rejects the name, telling his son that it no longer means anything to him. But the young Jedi does not retreat. He tells his father that he can feel the conflict inside him, that there is good in him still. Luke is doing exactly what the Revan rehabilitation had done, forcing the bond, refusing to sever it, treating the fallen as recoverable when every voice of caution would have called for execution. The Emperor watches. Sidious has spent his life closing exactly this kind of door, and he knows that if the boy succeeds, the work of 1,000 years collapses with it. So he engineers the duel, hoping the act of fighting will burn the bond away. It almost works. Luke is driven into rage and nearly takes the dark path himself, but standing over his defeated father, he looks at his own hand, sees the mechanical hand that mirrors Vader's, and stops. He throws the lightsaber away, then turns to face the Emperor and tells him he's a Jedi, like his father before him. The bond has not been severed, the fallen has not been lost, and the man underneath the armor is still Anakin Skywalker. The Emperor strikes, pouring darkside lightning into the boy. He intends to kill him slowly, in front of the man who once was a Jedi, and in that moment, Anakin Skywalker chooses. He picks up his master, carries him to the reactor shaft, and throws him down it. Anakin Skywalker, in the final moments of his life, returned to the light and destroyed the master who had corrupted him, and the only person who managed it was the one who had never read the file. This is the deepest revelation of the Revan and Vader parallel. The Jedi Order did not fall because the dark side was too strong. It fell because the Order stopped being curious about its own past. When an institution treats its history as decoration instead of a working tool, it will eventually run into a threat it has already beaten once and have no idea what it is looking at. Revan left them a record of exactly how it worked. The Order preserved it for 4,000 years, and then sent their most gifted knight to spend private evenings with the man running the same operation. And a son raised in obscurity on a desert planet ended up doing for his father what an entire council, surrounded by the greatest library in the galaxy, could not bring itself to do for one of its own. The record was complete, but the council just never opened it. But Palpatine did not invent this method. He inherited it. The master who taught him how to hide in plain sight, how to corrupt from within, how to weaponize a Jedi's own attachments against him, was Darth Plagueis. His story is where all of this began.